Hey everyone, we're back for part 2 of our lecture. We're going to drop right into the Romantic era. So I've decided to divide out the Romantic era into 2 sections, the early part of the era and the late part of the era. There are a lot of things that happen with the orchestra during the Romantic era. One of the most exciting things is the intrusion of secondary instruments, which really start to round out the woodwind family and also the presence of more primary instruments within the brass family. Towards the later part of the era, we also have a strong presence of the percussion family, both pitched and non-pitched instruments. And that trend of including these different kinds of timbres and sounds continues on into the 20th century for sure. So we're going to start along with the early part of the Romantic era and talk about Beethoven, who is a bridge composer, a composer who effectively bridges the gap between the classical era and the Romantic era. I picked a piece of his. He only has 9 symphonies, but his third symphony, his third and fifth symphonies are pieces that both exhibit traits that are very in line with the classical era, but also the Romantic era. One of them is the more stark contrasts in dynamic range between very loud and very soft moments. And we also have the inclusion of more brass featured moments or woodwind featured moments within the ensemble. So we're going to listen to his Symphony number 3, the Eroica Symphony, which was indeed dedicated to Napoleon and then undedicated to Napoleon. It's one of my sort of favorite stories and tangents that I go on. But the work is supposed to be the sonic representation of the feelings of the Enlightenment that Napoleon, before he crowned himself emperor, was said to really embody. So we have a very triumphant sounding symphony that really starts to sound quite cinematic, something that's going to come about in the later part of the Romantic era. And has a little bit more diversity in terms of who we're listening to. So the first thing that you're going to notice is that there's this huge emphasis on the strings, yes, but now we have a little bit more varied interest with the woodwind and the brass families. Let's go ahead and take a look at my lecture sheet before we listen to any listening examples. Okay, so we're dropping in right here. So secondary instruments. Secondary instruments are instruments that you learn after you learn the primary instrument. And like I said, they are instruments that kind of round out the instrumental family. So flute is our primary instrument. It's been around since the Baroque era. It's the instrument that you learn first. It has a couple of relatives, secondary instruments that are based off of the model of the flute. The piccolo happens to be half the size of the flute, typically made out of wood or a combination of wood and metal. It sounds 1 octave higher and is considerably more shrill and piercing than the flute. Likewise, the flute also has other relatives that exist later on in the Romantic era. As you can see over here, the alto or the bass flute that round out the bottom part of the spectrum and sound. They are lower in register than the flute. Again, they involve the same kind of mechanics of playing the instrument, but the body of the instrument is a little bit different. Good. Likewise, the clarinet, we have the introduction of the bass clarinet, and later on the soprano clarinet or the E-flat clarinet. The oboe has a secondary instrument or a relative that rounds out its family as well, the English horn, and the oboe d'amore, which is less commonly used today. The bassoon has a couple of other relatives, the contrabassoon and the contrabass bassoon. These are, again, instruments that use the same kind of instrumental body shape but they end up sounding different in terms of range to give us a wider kind of spectrum of sound. Likewise, we have an expansion within the brass family. We have horns, and which carry over from the previous era, but we have trumpets that make an appearance on the scene. Those come first, followed by the trombone, which has that fun slide to do sort of silly glissandi, or portamento, seamlessly going from one note to another. Likewise, the piano has a couple of secondary instruments that are relatives. The celeste, often associated with the sound of magic, for example, in cinematic scoring. We also have the harp. It's not a keyboard instrument, but it is grouped into that same family and category. Likewise, because Romantic era composers were interested in this idea of musical storytelling, even Beethoven's Symphony No. 3, Eroica, is a dedication to Napoleon, and has a programmatic context. Therefore, they end up using more percussive elements, something that can be effective for sound effects within a piece of music. We'll get to that a little later. Let's go ahead and listen to a little bit of Beethoven's Third Symphony so that you can get a sound or an idea for what the Romantic era symphony sounded like as compared to the classical era. Big things again that we're going to listen for is greater diversity within the instrumental families. Specifically, the woodwind family is much more diverse, but the emphasis is also going to be placed less on strings and more equally upon other families. All right, let me go ahead and cue up our listening example. Okay, so our speaker is going to give a small introduction about the historical relevance and sort of Beethoven's placement in his life and what was going on when he wrote the Third Symphony. To pass through some of the other speakers just to get our party started, so to speak, but some of what she has to say up front is interesting.
Well, our final piece of music tonight is the defining Third Symphony. Beethoven began composing it against a background of growing deafness. And after going through real despair, even contemplating suicide, he resolved that his art would be his salvation, and he threw himself into his work. What he produced outstripped anything he had previously written. Well, Julian, tell us exactly what it is about the Eroica that we're going to hear now that makes it so different.
The strange thing is, if you look on the stage, it won't look any different. The orchestra hasn't changed very much. There's an extra horn, there's 3 instead of 2. And then if you ignore the duration, which is quite a big thing to ignore because it's double the length of a classical symphony, it might look like an ordinary classical symphony in that it's got 4 movements, they're roughly in the same order. What's so different? Of course, it's what happens inside the music that really changes everything. I mean, the first movement, which makes so much of the drama of a kind of classical sonata form first movement. It produces these kind of brick walls of musical sound and builds up these dissonances, which nobody would have heard anything like in 1804, 1805.
Essentially, what our speaker is trying to get at is that the work itself is incredibly cinematic sounding. Because of its cinematic appeal, it has certainly withstood the test of time and is also kind of, as our speaker says, a longer work. All right, let's jump right into that, that very shocking sound for the turn of the century, Beethoven Symphony No. 3. Wow, that was an unfortunate thing. Hold on real quick. Okay, here we go. you can see the conductor. He's conducting in a very small triangle, but it's counting in 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. I know the video sometimes has lag, which is very annoying, but we're in compound time. From very, very loud to very, very soft, and going back to only including a small selection of the ensemble. Some stretching of time. Texture. Lots more call and response though. I guess it's a little bit Oboe has a solo responded by the strings. One thing that the Romantics are really a fan of doing though are stark contrasts within the piece. Going from everyone playing to only a small group of instruments playing. Going from very, very loud to very, very soft. This is much more romantic thing than classical. Double basses, melodic idea for a moment. It's a really excellent piece from start to finish. So I really encourage you to listen to more of it. But in terms of giving it lecture time, I think I've got enough of my argument, which is that we have a little bit more interplay between and among the different instrumental instrumental families. So before, in the classical era, we were really, really emphasizing the string family. That's not to say that the string family doesn't play a particularly important role here. They definitely do. However, there's much more interplay between the woodwind family and the string family, or the brass family, which of course, hopefully you saw there were 2 trumpets in the back, slight expansion of the brass family, and the woodwind family, or the combination of the 2 and the string family. Percussion instruments are still fairly limited. The timpani, the big gold or copper kettle drums in the back, are the first of the instruments to make an appearance in the percussion family. As we move forward, we're going to have much more diversity when it comes to percussion family instruments. So let's go ahead and push forward into the late Romantic era, where we're starting to hear even more or a stronger presence from secondary instruments, specifically in the woodwind family and the brass family, and a much more color-driven orchestra. Let's go ahead and toggle back to my lecture notes just to give us a refresher on what the instrumental ensemble looks like at this point. Okay, so late Romantic era orchestra. We have the inclusion of our lower woodwind voices when it comes to the flute, the alto flute, and the bass flute make an appearance. I talked about these other instruments, the soprano clarinet, the oboe d'amore, the contrabass bassoon. Now, not every orchestra includes every single secondary instrument, and that was kind of one of the fun things about repertoire from the Romantic era as a whole, is that the orchestra is a little bit more specialized on a piece-by-piece basis. So do all pieces involve celeste or celesta and harp? Absolutely not. But I'm pretty sure Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun has a pretty pronounced harp part, in addition to an inclusion of more diversity when it comes to the woodwind family in particular. So Debussy is our composer that we're going to be listening to, and the title alone reveals to us that it is a programmatic piece of music. It means it is doing some amount of musical storytelling. Whether that storytelling is very specific or much more vague is up to the composer, but this definitely falls within that umbrella. The opposite, as I've explained, to program music is absolute music. Music that is not meant to tell a story. Music that is just meant to be music on its own. So titles like symphony, number, blah, are absolute music titles. Other things that we're going to hear in this era, as opposed to the classical era, we're going to hear much more rubato, flexibility of time, pushing and pulling. We're still going to generally be within a metric feel, but that metric feel, especially within this next piece that we're going to listen to, is going to forever elude us. It feels very watercolor-y, very wishy-washy, I suppose. The other thing that we're going to encounter is, I think, a little bit more diversity when it comes to texture. Things that are not just straightforward homophonic, although that is the texture that we rely on most often. All right, let's go ahead and listen to Debussy's very beautiful piece, The Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. I love it. The horn is playing, the flutes have a solo, we've got some harp doing glissandi. Strings are doing so very, very little, providing a backdrop. They are not the main feature as they typically are. homophonic texture. She's our soloist, she's our melody, she's what we're mostly concerned about. Everything else is supporting her. Melody's been handed off to the oboe. Trading off in the woodwind family of who gets to be the primary voice, but otherwise the strings are supporting. We also have the inclusion of some pizzicato, some plucking of the instrument. The whole piece is beautiful. Please listen to the remaining like 7 minutes or so at some point. It's gorgeous, especially the end. The orchestra here, though, I think is so wildly different than from the Baroque era, where we were mostly focused on the strings and we couldn't give, we couldn't care any less about any other family. We were just about the string family. Whereas here, the strings are mostly the supporting family for this very interesting, colorful interplay within the woodwind family that gets to be our melodic interest. Watching Leonard Bernstein conduct is really, really satisfying. I hope you found when a piece involves more rubato or more flexibility of time, a conductor is much more necessary. This is also true regarding like the size of the instrumental ensemble, but in this case, as someone who is, as the conductor is someone who conveys time and tempo and pacing of a piece, when that pacing needs to push and pull in order to be effective, this piece would be totally different if it was mechanical in time. You do need someone to be that figurehead to show the rest of the ensemble what that pushing and pulling is going to look like. So a lot of it looks like very fancy arm waving, not always the case. For this piece, very necessary. Also, there's some information conveyed with dynamics in terms of the largeness of the conductor's pattern and the smallness. Usually it's something small is something that's very quiet. Something that's very big is very, very loud. Awesome. So hopefully I've convinced you that the Romantic era orchestra, especially the late Romantic era orchestra, is very different from the Classical era orchestra and even more different from the Baroque era orchestra. There are a couple of very interesting things that happened in the 20th century. So we're going to visit two different pieces in the 20th century in order to talk about the expanding orchestra, but also the sort of move to chamber music, or music that is does not require the forces of a conductor. Anyway, I will see you for our third and final part in a little bit here.